Every time we drive down the road, our cars leave behind tiny particles of pollution from our brakes, our tires, and the exhaust. And when it rains, that pollution flows into Puget Sound and it builds up in the fat stores of the southern resident killer whales. But the roads are not the only problem. Seattle's working waterfront is also a challenge.
You can see all the creosote pilings that are there. They're still leaching toxics into our waters.
Whether it's these toxic wood pilings or chemicals leaching from a scrap metal recycling facility, Seattle's working waterfront is a focus for Puget Soundkeeper.
When a lot of people think of stormwater, they think of roadways and parking lots and rooftops and things like that, but it's also industrial sites. And so the site over here and some of the ones behind me over here have been out of compliance with their stormwater permit.
Chris Wilkie is executive director of the nonprofit that investigates water polluters, focused here on contaminants that can have lethal effects on marine life.
There are chemicals like PCBs, lead, copper, and zinc at very high levels that are not safe for marine life. One of the key measures of that is whether or not it's safe to eat the fish. And we are going by right here to the right of the boat is a public fishing pier that has signs on it in 8 languages that's saying it's not safe to eat the fish.
The southern resident killer whales are often called some of the most contaminated marine mammals on Earth. Their fat is filled with toxics like PCBs, and when they don't have enough to eat, they metabolize that fat, and that poison ends up in their blood.
Start with the small microscopic organisms, and then tiny shrimp-like zooplankton, on up to herring, on up to salmon, and then on up to orcas and people. And every step of that food chain, those pollutants accumulate into, eventually, by the time you get to an orca whale, it's extremely unhealthy for the animal, but it's even unhealthy for the salmon and the herring as well.
Here at Seattle Iron and Metals, a fire last year caused even more concern. Puget Soundkeeper recently reached a $1 million settlement with the auto recycler, forcing them to make changes to protect the waterway. Wilkie says they're celebrating, but also critical of all the battles they have to fight.
And the state is really not living up to their mandate. A lot of the toxic contamination issues that we have with our salmon and our orcas can really be traced to the fact that the state of Washington is not enforcing the Clean Water Act to the extent that they should. And when citizen groups like ours are able to step up and force industries into compliance, that's a good thing. But it shouldn't be falling on us to do this. This is really the central job of the state.
The port says that it's done a lot to clean up the waterfront out here. Here's Port Commissioner Fred Fellman.
Study of killer whales was my motivation for public service, and I'm proud of what the Port of Seattle has done to restore some of the polluted sites that they inherited. We're not making marine sanctuaries, but we are making life better for both the whales and the people who depend on the marine environment. We have over 8 marine parks that provide public access for the public, but also cleaned up the water so it becomes more swimmable, more fishable, but still we have a long way to go.
Our wastewater flows into Puget Sound in both treated and untreated forms, and microbes like fungus and bacteria and other parasites make it into the marine environment. So scientists want to know how those microbes are affecting the southern resident orcas. Whenever a southern resident killer whale comes up for a breath, it sprays a mist into the air. It's a plume of valuable information
that contain material from their lungs and their respiratory tract, and we hope to capture that on this nylon mesh if we're lucky. And then we'll close it back up again, and after that we'll extract the droplets that are stuck to the mesh.
Linda Rhodes is a microbiologist with NOAA who is part of a team that's trying to understand how the killer whales are impacted by the tiniest of problems, microscopic organisms that are invisible to the human eye. Though lack of food is often a focus of recovery for the orcas, who depend on Chinook salmon, which are also dwindling in number, it's possible that disease is making the whales less likely to eat or even more vulnerable to infection.
They carry a lot of parasitic worms in their intestinal tract, and it's not a surprise because these particular kinds of parasitic worms also infect salmon, and they actually need both the fish and the mammal for that parasitic worm to complete its life cycle.
3 years ago, 20-year-old male L95 was found dead from an infection that started at the site of a satellite tag, and researchers admitted they hadn't followed proper disinfecting protocols.
Started at the skin and spread to the lungs, and we figured out what species of fungus that is. And it's a fungus that is very invasive once it gets inside of the animal. And actually, it's a fungus that also infects humans. And when it's in humans, it's a very bad situation.
L95's death showed scientists that infections may be a challenge for recovery of the whales, who often show signs of a mysterious condition called peanut head before they die. Rhodes' team is trying to trace the connection between the health of the whales and our wastewater. This malfunction at King County's Magnolia Treatment Facility in 2017 released hundreds of millions of gallons of untreated waste. But even on a rainy day, there's a lot of human waste entering Puget Sound and the Salish Sea.
I was looking at a study where on one day in October in 2016, just from the city of Seattle, somewhere on the order of 150 million gallons got dumped into Puget Sound through these combined sewer overflows, or CSOs. And the estimate for Vancouver, BC is something on the order of 12 billion gallons of untreated waste.
In some cases, Rhodes' team has found detectable human fecal material far offshore and deep in the water, indicating our more urban waters are far more contaminated.
It's our responsibility to understand what we are doing, because we are the one thing that can change.
The southern resident killer whales are often called some of the most contaminated marine mammals on Earth, and it's because they spend a lot of time in urban waterways like this. So every other year, scientists survey fish all around where I'm sitting right now to test them for toxic contaminants. It's a beautiful day on Elliott Bay, but if this fish survey teaches you anything, it's that what you see on the surface doesn't tell the whole tale. This net is about to pull up fish who live near the floor of Puget Sound. Fish who are exposed to contaminants in the sediment.
Here's a Pacific herring. These are spawning in Elliott Bay.
Jim West and a team with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife have been doing these surveys for nearly 30 years.
We got about 4 or 5 species of sole in here, and we're trying to pick out the ones that are called English sole. Here's a skate.
Once the fish are sorted and the rest return to the water, the English sole are put in a holding tank.
It represents what's happening on the seafloor in the sediments. A lot of contaminants end up in the sediments. And so we want a species that's living there and feeding in the sediments. But in the sediments, the contaminant loads in Puget Sound are pretty much in the urban areas. So we can find English sole out in the middle of Puget Sound that are really clean, but as soon as you move into a place like Elliott Bay here, they're highly contaminated.
West says in 7 of 10 survey sites, the contaminants are either not declining or getting worse.
Over the course of our lives, the more we eat, the more it accumulates. And if we eat a fish, we are then consuming and accumulating what the fish has eaten. And so as you move up the food chain, you get higher and higher concentrations of these bioaccumulative contaminants.
Senior research scientist Sandy O'Neill calls the fish an indicator species that gives early warning signs of the health of Puget Sound. They're tested for chemicals used decades ago, like PCBs, as well as what are called contaminants of emerging concern, like pharmaceuticals.
When you get a prescription, you go to the pharmacist, the first thing the pharmacist does is looks at your list of medications and tells you, is it okay to take this medication with that medication? The fish don't have that option. They're getting exposed to a whole slew of them all at once.
The scientists have found compounds that model estrogen are likely causing male fish to produce female egg yolk protein, and that includes salmon, a favorite food for the southern resident orcas.
It throws off their hormone balance, and it could affect their ability to reproduce.
The long-term monitoring data that we produce can be used to document effectiveness of any management actions that are implemented. So we are going to see declines in contaminant levels in herring and juvenile salmonids before we're going to see declines in contaminants in killer whales. So they will be our early warning indicator species that things are getting better or worse.
Cities all around Western Washington are starting to take inventory of their effects on the southern resident orcas. In fact, Shoreline just became the first city in Washington state to become salmon safe certified, and they're second in the country only to Portland. But it did not come without its share of mistakes and lessons learned. Shoreline's new City Hall building was meant to be a beacon of environmental advocacy.
We built in a number of environmental features. The green roof on top of City Council chambers have plants that filter the rain and slow it down before it goes into our stormwater system. There's hot water heated by the sun on top of the council chambers, and on top of the parking garage there's a huge solar array to generate electricity.
But after it was finished, city officials learned the building was actually bad for salmon.
We built the building to meet up to a very high level of industry standards, but that standard didn't take into account stormwater. And it was when we started looking more at water quality and salmon protections that we realized that the building itself was a source of stormwater pollution that needed to be treated.
Shoreline Mayor Will Hall showed us the problem. The building's outside walls are coated in zinc, and zinc is toxic for fish, like the Chinook salmon that make up the main prey for endangered southern resident killer whales. That's when Shoreline decided to get even stricter with its building codes.
Our community wants to see salmon and orca whales in the future, and so they're demanding that our local governments do its part. So we're looking for ways to become better for the environment, and the Salmon Safe certification is the program that's helping us learn to do better.
Now the second city in the entire country to be certified salmon safe, new infrastructure will have to follow stricter building codes. The city is also focusing on green infrastructure like this park, designed to trap stormwater and filter contaminants, just like these rain gardens on Aurora Avenue.
We've watched this region grow for the past 5 decades. All of that growth is having an impact. Every time a car drives down the road, it leaves little bits of its tires, little bits of its brake pads, little bits of its exhaust. And then when it rains, that rain carries all of that pollution into Puget Sound, and that's part of what's killing our salmon and killing the ecosystem. So people in this community are saying enough is enough. They want us to clean up the environment, and that's what's driving our city council to take these steps.
Hall says they're committed to do whatever they can here in Shoreline, whether it's a short sidewalk built with material that traps stormwater or a big park that reminds everyone of the future they want to see.
My hope is that here in the city of Shoreline, we'll learn to make all of our practices safe for the salmon, and that other cities around the region will follow suit, and that our children and grandchildren will be able to go salmon fishing and watch the orca whales just like we did when we were kids.
Lack of food is the #1 threat to the survival of the southern resident killer whales. Coming up, we'll tell you why salmon are disappearing and what we can all do to save them and the orcas who depend on them.